Ladies and gentlemen, today I did want to continue the discussion on AFL expansion. And today we are going to be talking about a potential AFL team in New Zealand. Now, there has been quite a lot of dialogue, particularly online, about a potential AFL team in New Zealand. Would it work? Is it a realistic option? Is it going to happen? Would the AFL consider it? And we are going to be discussing that today. I haven't really seen this discussed in terms of the media or by any sort of official channels, but definitely online in forums, etc. there has been a little bit of talk about this. Now, we know New Zealand, one of only two overseas countries that has previously hosted an AFL game, of course, China being the other one. And in terms of the market itself, it is big enough to host an AFL team, population around 5.3 million total, which is similar to a Sydney or Melbourne. In terms of the breakdown of cities, we do have 1.7 mil in Auckland, so that would fit as around the fifth biggest city in Australia between Perth and Adelaide, and the capital Wellington possibly the other option with about 440k living there. In terms of the actual stadium situation, it is a bit complicated because Auckland, I think, would be the most logical place to base the team, being the biggest city, but there is no suitable stadium at this point. And you'd think, New Zealand, they do play cricket. Surely anywhere that cricket is played, you could play AFL. But the cricket ground in Auckland is basically Eden Park, which is a rugby ground. And the dimensions for cricket, if you've watched any games there, you'd know the straight boundaries are really tiny, only about 55 metres. There's a lot of sixes. So that is not quite long enough to be an AFL ground. Not to mention the capacity would be way too high for a New Zealand team. So the logical option is actually Wellington. And you will remember it has hosted AFL games at Sky Stadium before. St Kilda playing 3 games there between 2013 and 2015. Capacity is about 34k, which is probably too big for a New Zealand AFL team, but we know the dimensions are fine. It is an oval stadium. It has hosted AFL games before, so we know it works, but the capacity is probably a bit too big. In terms of the crowds they did get at those games, the first one in 2013, between St Kilda and Sydney, they did get around 22k, which is a good result, but in the following 2 years, it really did taper off. They got 13k in 2014 and 12k the following year in 2015. And at that point, St Kilda exited the New Zealand agreement and did not continue playing games there. In terms of the stadium itself, the exterior is pretty ugly, I would say. Some people might like it, but it is very bland and boring. And the yellow seats really do stick out when you do have a low crowd, which would be the case for a New Zealand-based AFL team. So those factors aren't ideal, but it is a fairly modern stadium. You are going to get a lot of the modern amenities. So in that respect, it is probably a decent option. In terms of the Auckland stadium situation, there has been a big push over a number of years for a custom-built cricket oval in the city of Auckland that is suitable for hosting Test cricket. We know Test cricket not really played at Eden Park because of the massive capacity, over 55k, and also you could argue that the boundaries aren't really suitable for Test cricket either, because it is effectively a rugby stadium that they are moving the seats out to host cricket. But there has been some dialogue recently about a potential renovation of Victoria Park into a 21,000 capacity stadium for Test cricket. Now, these renderings were released in early 2024, and looking at this stadium, you would say this probably fits the bill in terms of what you would be looking for as a New Zealand-based AFL team. Capacity of 21,000 is suitable. We know they're probably not going to be filling that, but in the case of a big final or a big game, you do want a decent amount of people to be able to get into the facility. You can see here there's basically one large grandstand with an overhang, and the rest of the ground is more or less grass banks. You do have some nice views there of the city and some nice greenery surrounding the ground, which is good. The one issue I would have with this is, as we know, Aussie rules is a winter sport, so a grass bank in New Zealand, it does get cold, windy, rainy there. Potentially you would prefer to see that enclosed, at least with seating and some sort of canopy or overhang protecting people from the elements. But if this does get built, I think this would be where the team would play. And I would like to see, even if a New Zealand team isn't coming in the short to medium term, I would like to see the AFL playing a game or two here a year just to test the waters, test the market, see if there's any interest. from the local population. And you could argue with having the team based out of Auckland instead of Wellington that there is a bit more competition. Auckland is the host of the Warriors in the NRL and also the New Zealand Breakers in the NBL. And we know rugby union obviously is popular all over the country. Every major city does host a rugby union team, whereas Wellington, it's really only got the Wellington Phoenix in the A-League, and that does play during summer. There has been a little bit of talk potentially about a second New Zealand team coming into the NRL based either in Wellington or in the South Island, probably Christchurch, so that could complicate things for the AFL if that does happen. But ideally, I think you want a split of, say, 7 games in Auckland, 3 in Wellington and 1 in the South Island, probably at Hagley Oval in Christchurch, just to tap into that market. South Island, of course, a much lower population density and total population than the North Island, so 1 game is probably a happy medium. But overall, this team and the AFL in general would struggle to get any sort of relevancy. We know rugby union, massive. Rugby league also very popular in New Zealand. And generally, Kiwis are at best unfamiliar or at worst hostile to the AFL. And that is due to a number of factors. Obviously, they do have a bit of an inferiority complex when it comes to Australia, so they are going to be quite hostile to any Australian thing. And if you've ever talked to a New Zealander when they're watching an AFL game, they say, oh, this is really complicated. It's such a mess. I don't know what's going on. It's like seagulls fighting over a chip. The barriers to entry in terms of the acceptance of the game itself are already so high that it would make it a very difficult thing to establish a team in New Zealand and get it up and running. And you could say the same for Queensland and New South Wales, but there is at least some familiarity with the game in those states. They do generally understand how it works, how the scoring works, even if they don't get every last intricacy of it. But New Zealand is really like starting from scratch and a completely blank canvas. And I think the team would probably average 3 to 4K a game, at least for the first 10 years, until they begin to build up a really strong supporter base and get an understanding for the game in the country itself. The AFL would need to be pouring more money into this, significantly more money into this than what they do to GWS, and we already know that is a massive figure. In terms of the travel, some people will say that's an issue, but the flight time to the East Coast, about 3 hours, so it's similar to Perth. You could say the flight from Perth to New Zealand, 7 to 8 hours, it is a lot. But other sports do manage. We know there are Perth and New Zealand teams in the NBL, in the A-League. Has been some talk about a potential Perth team in the NRL. So if they can manage, I'm sure the AFL can by scheduling buys and whatnot around those long trips. But to summarise, I really think this is unlikely to happen, at least within the next 50 to 100 years. There's probably a number of other markets that the AFL would look at going into before New Zealand. You could mention North Queensland, Newcastle, Canberra, Darwin, all probably more realistic options than New Zealand. Even a third team in Perth or Adelaide as well, you could throw in there. Maybe if this boutique stadium in Auckland does get built, the AFL can go back to playing a game every year there just to try and drum up a little bit of support, test the waters a bit. But I think if the AFL was to bring in New Zealand as the 20th team, it would be an absolute disaster. But you can almost say with certainty it is not going to happen in this round of expansion. That is just about all we're going to have time for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.